to welcome you on this cold day to this planning meeting. My name is Malcolm Little and I'm chair of the Strathbogie Shire Planning Committee. I will just run through the agenda, how we'll do it. On each report, we'll hear from the planners, and then we'll hear from the submitters. And the submitters, there's some speaking in favour of the applicant and some speaking against the application. The recommendation will be put to the committee, and they'll debate it, and then the recommendation will be put to the vote. Until further notice, all meetings conducted by Strathbogie Shire Council will be virtually using Zoom and live streamed on our website at www.strathbogie.vic.gov.au. This ensures we are meeting the Victorian Government's social distancing requirements to slow the spread of coronavirus, COVID-19, and help keep our communities safe. We encourage all community members to watch the meeting online, given we have had to close the public gallery until further notice following legal advice around how to comply with COVID-19 social distancing rules. People wishing to make submissions for items on the planning committee agenda may do so by 1, submitting a further written statement, which will be read by the chair, 2, requesting to make their submission via telephone, or 3, making their presentation via a pre-recorded video that is sent to council prior to the meeting. The planning department will be in touch with relevant parties prior to the meeting so that appropriate arrangements can be made. I acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. For those of you with an agenda, we've just ticked off 2 of them. We'll move on to apologies. Are there any apologies? If not, could I have someone confirm the minutes of the Planning Committee meeting held on the Tuesday, the 19th of May, 2020? Thank you, Councillor Mason. Second by disclosures of interest.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just put on record.
I'm sorry. All those in favour of accepting the minutes? All those against? Thank you, Phil. Sorry, Chris, go.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to put a interest, people may deem that I've got a personal interest or an indirect interest in this item 6.2 because of my friendship with certain members of the people who have objected to this. They are not family friends. They are not related to me in any way. I've only met them through working with the land care groups of the area and land management. So in any discussions I've had with those people has not in any way altered my way of thinking on this. This is the way I vote will be my way, and I believe what's the best way for the community. So that's where my disclosure ends.
Thank you, Councillor O'Byrne. I would like to read the following statement. I personally would like to take this opportunity to be transparent about my dealings with the Longwood Plains Conservation Management Network, who I note have lodged an objection to agenda item P2019-157. The network has previously provided me with unpaid advice around rehabilitating my farm through the Grey Box Grassy Woodlands project and the Ribbons of Blue Slashes of Green project grant programs awarded by the Goulburn Broken Catchment Management Authority. While I do not consider that this gives rise to a direct or indirect conflict of interest that would require me to exclude myself from the decision-making process for this agenda item, I wish to be open about my dealings with the network. Okay, we'll move on to planning reports. And we go to page 1 on your agenda. Planning Committee report number 1 in the hands of our Principal Planner, Melissa Crane. And it's planning permit application number 2019-152. It's a 5-lot subdivision, 4 lots into 5, removal of native vegetation at 27 River Street, Nagambie. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This application is for a re-subdivision of land at 27 River Street, Nagambie. The land currently contains a single dwelling over 4 existing allotments, 3 of which currently have direct access to River Street and 1 which is technically landlocked. The proposal will re-subdivide those allotments and add an additional one to create 5 lots, all with direct access to River Street. The property is in the general residential zone, and the proposed lot sizes will have an average of 1,026 square metres, going from 838 square metres to 1,268 square metres. Because the proposal creates lots that are less than 4,000 square metres in size, all the vegetation on the property is deemed lost under the clause 52.17 native vegetation of the Strathbogie planning scheme and must be offset appropriately, and that's why it's included in the proposal for this application. Goulburn Murray Water and DELP, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, were referral authorities on this application. The Goulburn Murray Water advised that they could support it with a building exclusion zone that was within 20 metres of the edge of the lake. And the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning raised no objection, subject to conditions for the vegetation removal that was subsequential to the subdivision. Most of the vegetation is within the building exclusion zone, and the recommendation includes a Section 173 agreement to provide a level of protection on the vegetation along the frontage of the water from a landscape perspective, because under the native veg regulations, it is considered lost. One objection was received, and it raised some concerns with the size of the lots, the potential for double-storey dwellings on those allotments, and some traffic impacts along River Street. The lot size being over 1,000 square metres per each on average is considered generally in accordance with the existing pattern of subdivision along River Street and the broader area. And the types of dwellings that are built on residential allotments are generally not managed under the planning regulations. So when these lots are developed, that if somebody wanted to build a single or a double-storey dwelling, they could, as long as they're complying with the building regulations. And the objector and I have actually had a conversation in relation to that matter. River Street is actually a sealed road with curb and channel and fully constructed drainage as well, and is considered more than capable of handling the extra traffic that will be generated as part of this subdivision. It's respectfully recommended that we issue a notice of decision to grant a permit subject to a range of conditions on this matter. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Melissa. I notice there's one objection to this, but no one has registered to speak to the application. So we'll move on, and I'll ask if someone would move that it's recommended that council resolve to issue a notice of decision to grant a permit in accordance with this officer's recommendation. And I notice there's 22 conditions and 1 planning note. Someone like moved by Councillor McLaren, seconded by, thank you, Councillor Gardner. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that this planning application to move the subdivision from 4 lots into 5 lots and fix up the anomaly with the landlocked block is a good one for Nagambie. I think that we are seeing a lot of growth in Nagambie, and where we can see lots being used to increase the residential offering, I think is a good thing. I note all in the recommendations, all the points put forward, and I support this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McLaren. Councillor Gardner.
Mr. Chairman, I endorse what Councillor McLaren has said. I think it is a good utilisation of the block with its proximity to the water. And as Councillor McLaren said, the growth in Nagambie is going to need more such lots.
Thank you, Councillor Gardner. Any other comments? Any other queries, comments? If not, it is recommended that council resolve to issue a notice of decision to grant a permit in accordance with the officer's recommendation. All those in favour? All those against? That's carried 7 love. Thank you. Now move on to page 33. And this is planning report number 2, again in our capable hands of our principal planner, Melissa. It's planning permit application number P2019-157, removal of native vegetation, 50 Allura Drive, Nagambie. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this application is for the removal of native vegetation on 50 Allura Drive, Nagambie in the northeastern section of the broader property. The removal will allow the development of a residential village that is a part that is allowed to happen under the zone that applies to this parcel of land. The application was lodged in December 2019 with a report outlining a proposed tree removal of 3.026 hectares of vegetation, which included 73 large trees and 2 small trees. This was considered a detailed assessment under the relevant provisions of clause 52.17 native vegetation, and the application was referred to the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. In January, the application was notified directly to nearby and adjoining owners, and one formal objection was received at that point. DELP requested further information and a site meeting, at which time the applicant arranged for the original proposal as 73 trees to be marked on the site with tape in approximately February this year. A number of meetings were held between council staff, the applicant and DELP, at which point led to a reduction in the amount of vegetation to 2.103 hectares and 51 large trees, with 1 small tree also included in that proposal. After assessing that part of the proposal against the guidelines for the removal, destruction and lopping of native vegetation, DELP provided conditional consent to this level of removal to occur. The original objection was withdrawn at that point, and then a number of new objections were also lodged to the application. It is noted that there are currently, at about 12 o'clock today when we left the office, 49 submissions to the application, with 4 being in support of the proposal and 45 objecting. The supporting submissions talk to the opportunities of the development of the lifestyle village will have on the broader township in terms of both provision of services and economic growth, with a consideration to the environment through the design of the proposal. The objections raised a number of concerns, and I wanted to just touch on them in each of them in turn. Initially, one of the concerns was that it was raised how the proposal addressed all the state and council strategic documents that talk to retention of native vegetation within our natural environment. And from a planning perspective, all of these documents were duly considered, and they are discussed in relative detail within the planning report in front of you today. Essentially, the predominant considerations in this instance are referenced in the Strathbogie planning scheme, and particularly under clause 52.17. And the application has been deemed to comply with these documents by both the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning and council officers. Secondly, the impacts on native fauna have been raised. In their assessment, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning did recommend a condition for a suitably qualified person to be on site during the works to ensure any native animals could be protected and relocated appropriately. This has been included in the recommended conditions in front of you today, and it is considered that this actually should reasonably address the concerns raised in terms of native animals. Objections have also drawn attention to the principles of avoid and minimise within the guidelines that are the main source of assessment for this application. The amount of vegetation to be removed has been reduced throughout the planning process itself, and has been assessed against all the relevant requirements under both the Planning and Environment Act and Strathbogie Planning Scheme. DELP provided conditional consent to the application and did note in their response that there had been genuine attempts to avoid and minimise by the applicant. Council officers have also worked with the applicant to achieve a reduced outcome to address these guidelines. While there have been concerns with the state government policies of offsets to be purchased to allow vegetation removal, and we do recognise that there tend to be philosophical positions about how that state government policy is framed, it's not a planning consideration we can take into account. We have to take into account whether or not the application in front of us has demonstrated avoid and minimise to the point where conditional consent can be given, which it was by the department, and that the offsetting provisions that are available in those instances is an appropriate response. In this case, it was demonstrated that the offsetting can be achieved and is considered an appropriate response in that instance. Concerns were also raised about the impacts on the waterway. And whilst the vegetation removal here is not proposed along the waterway itself, the zone that supports the development of this allotment will require an environmental plan be provided to council and be approved prior to any works commencing on the actual village itself. And that environmental plan has specific requirements about waterway health and impacts along that in that context. A condition has also been included in the recommendation to make sure that this permit is quite closely tied to those plans requiring that approval to ensure that they are reflective of each other, of each permission. Council officers do recognise that with sensitive planning matters, these considerations are very difficult for all people involved. However, from a planning perspective, we are required to look at the proposal as it is placed before us, have due consideration for any referral authorities' responses to the proposal that we have been working with, and base our assessment on the current legislation, reference documents and decision guidelines that support the Strathbogie planning scheme. On balance, all of the relevant provisions of the Planning and Environment Act and the Strathbogie planning scheme have been addressed, and it is respectfully submitted that the application complies with all those relevant parts. And I'd like to recommend that a notice of decision to grant a permit be issued. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Melissa. Okay, now there's been, we heard there's been, I think, 45 objections to this, and we have 9 submitters this afternoon that wish to speak. Some of them for the application, some of them against the application. And they are Tim Goodacre on behalf of Goonagambie, Nikki McEwen, Deb Randalls, Rhonda Robertson on behalf of the Longwood Plains Conservation Management Network, Donna Winter-Irving, James Winter-Irving, Moya Stewart and Ross Murray. And I haven't got the name of the 9th person, but they'll be there. And speaking for the applicant, Michael Locasano on behalf of Hallmark Constructions. So we've got time, we've got 3 minutes for each speaker. So if you could just stick to the 3 minutes, we'll give you a little warning at 2.5 minutes, a very polite little warning. And we call on Tim Goodacre on behalf of Goonagambie. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, look, I've timed this at about 3 minutes, so and I will stick to script for that reason. Look, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to address council on this issue, and I take it that my earlier submission has been recorded. I represent Goonagambie, which is comprised of more than 100 businesses in the Ngambie and Avenel region. We have about half a dozen larger businesses as members, including Hallmark, but the remainder are small businesses comprising single traders, family partnerships and tradespeople. Today, I'm also representing a number of community members who have approached me directly to represent their concerns to council. These people in the main don't use social media and feel intimidated speaking at public meetings. I'm pleased to represent all these people because this is one of the most important issues to come before council in my time as president of Goonagambie. So just some background on me for the information of council and others here today. I've lived in Ngambie for nearly 10 years. I still work part-time and I live on a 60-acre block. I don't have stock, I don't own a firearm and have well over 100 mature grey box and red gums on my property. I've also planted over 3,500 trees over the last few years. I will be planting many more than 51 trees in the next year alone. As I said, this is a critically important issue, and I'm hoping council, in making its decision, will take into account the following issues of concern to the people that I'm here representing today. First, I've spent some time over the past year speaking to Hallmark about what they're planning for the lifestyle village and what it means for the residents of Ngambie. I've also visited with other Ngambie people their equivalent development at Point Cook. I've also talked to a lot of people in Ngambie about the development and what it may mean for them. Let's be clear, this is not a slash and burn development where every piece of vegetation is removed. In fact, quite the opposite, because people will want to live there because it's sympathetic to the treed environment in which it is located. The plans, in my mind, are very clear in that regard. It's also on private, not public land, and its purpose for use has always been over a number of years for some form of residential development. That has not suddenly changed despite reports in social media. And whether or not the general public gets access, whatever happens going forward, is entirely up to the owner. But let's get back to the positive things that development brings to Ngambie, which unfortunately have not seen much to date from others. Most importantly, these issues directly affect people's lives. They relate to people's future living arrangements and or their employment opportunities in Ngambie in what are clearly very uncertain economic times. Bear in mind also that Ngambie only has 2,000 permanent residents, and despite a number of proposals to invest in Ngambie over the last few years, this is only the third which has actually been built or got to shovel-ready stage. Whether the others happen now is obviously very much open to question. So what are the important issues? And I'll quickly.
That's 3 minutes.
Yeah, okay, well, I'll take the rest as read. They're basically, as the economic arguments, and particularly for those people who want to stay in Ngambie, have a lifestyle opportunity to live in a secure and safe environment. So if I can table this, Malcolm, I would appreciate that and take it as read.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
So, okay, our next speaker is Nikki McEwen. I hope I got McEwen right. Is that right?
Depends if you're Irish, it'll be McKeown. But
Okay.
for the purpose of Australians, we say McEwen.
Okay, thanks, Nikki.
Thank you.
3 minutes.
I was really pleased to read about the set of principles and values on the Shire website that guides all of your decisions and actions. And in particular, the following 2 principles. 1, to sustainably manage our natural and built environment, promoting and supporting environmental initiatives, protecting and enhancing our natural environmental assets. And secondly, to enhance community health and wellbeing, planning for improved community health, wellbeing and livability, engaging and participating with the community in council and community initiatives. It is on these 2 key principles which you have committed to that I base my objection to the removal of 51 trees at the proposed development site. In regard to our natural environment, I too want to see you stand up and protect it. We have a most valuable natural asset here within our township that should be celebrated by residents and visitors alike. I don't agree that the applicant for the development has complied with the avoid and minimise principle. Yes, the number of trees earmarked for destruction has been reduced somewhat, but certainly I would hope for a better attempt to avoid and minimise than 51 trees. Perhaps when the initial proposal was accepted several years ago, people were not as aware of the true value that such trees provide for biodiversity and our environment, but the evidence is clear now. In regard to improving our community's health, wellbeing and livability, perhaps the benefits of nature and access to green space were unknown when the initial proposal was accepted. However, the evidence about the benefits to physical and mental health and improved social connection are now clear. There is resounding evidence as stated in Healthy Parks, Healthy People, the State of the Evidence 2015, a state government document, as well as other local, state and national policy documents, many of which you have used to guide your development of Sustainable Strathbogie 2030, that access to green space and nature improve population health outcomes. Perhaps previous councillors did not know the negative effects of their decision. Just like our predecessors perhaps did not think about the consequences of removing and destroying so much of our natural environment. Perhaps. But we do know about the environmental and population health impacts now. And you have committed Strathbogie Shire to protecting our environment and improving our community's health. When we know better, which we do now, we need to make better decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Next is Deb Randalls. Thank you, Deb. 3 minutes.
This habitat has enormous value for local residents, the community, the wildlife and surrounding waterways, new residents of the village, our children and future generations. It provides for Indigenous plants and animals who we rely on for pollination of our fruit and vegetables and food security for our children. It provides a microclimate, offering shelter and shade from the harsh sun. The old trees provide a beautiful and unique landscape for people to enjoy the outdoors, the very environment new residents are looking for when making their tree change. Waking up to birdsong and the therapeutic value of walking amongst trees. Frog ponds for grandchildren to explore are just a few examples. It protects the health of our waterways by controlling erosion, surface water pollution, and it nurtures biodiversity, all needed for our sustainable community. This habitat has a valuable connection to our town and the potential to maximise public access to the lake, which is a major tourist attraction. We have a responsibility to our children, and my daughter's upstairs listening to this, to create and adapt to a changing climate experienced last summer by devastating bushfires across the state and scorching heat. We don't know how many species are needed to keep the planet green and healthy, but we are testing its limits. Extinction is forever. Many habitats are becoming too small to sustain wildlife. Protecting the remaining areas gives our children much needed hope in these uncertain times. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Deb. And next is Rhonda Robinson on behalf of the Longwood Plains Conservation Management Network. Thanks, Rhonda.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
3 minutes.
Firstly, I'd like to make it perfectly clear to Council that our objection is based purely on the application to remove 51 trees and that we have no objection to the development of the proposed lifestyle village. As you're aware, the native vegetation regulations were amended in 2017, placing much more emphasis on avoidance as a first step. The applicant's avoid and minimise statement in the Nature Advisory Report state that the applicant's efforts to avoid must focus on the areas of native vegetation that have the most value. However, of the 51 trees marked for removal by the applicant, 43 have an environmental protection value of very high, high and medium value. This clearly demonstrates that they are not avoided the trees of the highest value. An application to remove native vegetation must demonstrate or provide appropriate evidence to show that there is no other options exist to avoid native vegetation removal. The applicant has also failed to demonstrate avoidance of high-value native veg by locating the club rooms, car park and bowling green in the area that requires so many trees to be removed rather than on already cleared land. Not to mention the removal of trees to create open space. Our expert environmental advice is that this proposal has been assessed solely on the development needs of the site, rather than avoiding the removal of trees that are of the highest ecological value. When assessing this application under the decision guidelines, Council must consider, and I quote, the proposed use or development has been appropriately sited or designed to avoid and minimise impacts on native vegetation. We strongly believe that this has not been the case in this application. A better solution would be if we could work together to achieve an outcome that would enhance both the environment and the development. We therefore urge Council not to approve this application in its present form. If, however, Council vote in favour of this application, it leaves us no other option but to exercise our right of appeal to this decision. Thank you.
And next is Donna Winteroving. Thanks, Donna. It's 3 minutes.
Something that I need everybody to have a copy of.
Thank you.
my day job. This anyway, that's for sure.
Thanks, Donna. You've got 3 minutes.
Thank you. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Tungarung people and pay our respects to the elders, past and present. Thank you for this opportunity. We speak today with honesty, openness and respect, and trust that everybody that is involved in this conversation will do the same. My husband James and I object to the removal of any vegetation for the Avington lifestyle development and not the actual development itself. We have 2 questions that must be investigated thoroughly before a planning permit is issued for the removal of the vegetation. 1, could a nationally threatened grassy woodland community be present? And 2, is the patch of potential grey box grassy woodlands of sufficient quality for the national listing? I refer to the flow charts 1 and 2 that you have in front of you from the guide to identifying, assessing grey box and grasslands in southeast Australia, which only 10 and 15% exist. If you follow the highlighted pathway, the one factor questioning the listing is the presence of 10% native grasses. The recommended spring-summer timing for the native vegetation assessment determines the accuracy of the classification. The Nature Advisory Assessment for Hallmark was done on the 17th and 18th of June 2019 in winter. It was suggested by the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning to the developer that they go through the Environment Protection, Biodiversity, Conservation Gateway referral process for further assessment, and this has not been done. So I want you to have a look at that, and I've highlighted to go through there. The only part that is missing is the grasses. So I close with a quote from Chris McGrath, barrister and associate professor at the University of Queensland Global Change Institute. Simply writing that nature has rights into an act doesn't change the power dynamic. The power dynamic is weighted by who has the money. Thank you.
James Winter-Irving. Thanks, James. 3 minutes.
Good afternoon to Council. I am objecting to the removal of 51 trees from the Allura estate. These trees are an important part of an environment and community dynamics. Community dynamics is the ever-changing patterns in the development of living communities. Of the 4 ecosystem processes, community dynamics is the most vital. Water and minerals cannot cycle effectively, and solar energy cannot flow through our life unless plants of some form, from algae to trees, first convert sunlight to usable energy for life and cover the soil. For this reason, it is imperative that we learn to maintain healthy biological communities, whether they be associated with grasslands, forests, lakes, coral reefs or oceans. This situation is developing into a case of the corporate dollar versus the community. The removal of these trees does not help our community. It will actually destroy the foundation of it by putting everything out of balance. My recommendation to the Planning Committee is to vote against the removal of native vegetation, 2.1 hectares, including 51 large trees from 50 Allura estate. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And next is Moya Stewart. Thanks, Moya. Just 3 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'll make this short because I really hate public speaking. And you need to know that the only reason that I'm here is how important this is to me. And it's probably the second time I've spoken in front of a group of people like this before, ever. I believe that these threatened old growth trees and their surrounding habitat need to be retained. We are blessed to have one of the few remaining areas of grey box grassy woodlands within our township. Many of our residents enjoy this area as I did today. Imagine this. Take a short walk from High Street to the background noise of cars and lawnmowers. As you enter the gravel road leading into Buckley Park, you will be walking towards the canopy of these threatened gum trees. You will notice the noise of the cars and the lawnmowers quickly fading away against the new sounds of trickling water, frog song and bird song. These trees and their surrounding habitat help our mental health, providing us with peace and mindfulness, so important today with rising rates of bad mental health. These trees aid our physical health as well by providing fresh air for us to breathe and filtered water for us to drink. These trees aren't just beneficial for our health, but for the health of the wildlife that live amongst them. Our wildlife is already up against it with bushfires, global warming and pollution. It'd be cruel to add homelessness as well. You could argue that we can plant trees somewhere else to replace these trees, except that it would take over 100 years for these new trees to develop the hollows required for the new homes. Councillors, Strathbogie Shire strives to give us the impression that it cares for our natural environment. So I ask, why are we even debating the need to reject this application? I ask you to leave a legacy of your time on Strathbogie Shire Council by saving this area for Ngambie and its future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Moya. And Ross Murray. Thanks, Ross. 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. My name's Ross Murray. My wife and I own 49 Blaney Lane. We plan to build a home overlooking the creek and the bush to the west. Our understanding at the time of purchase was that a retirement village in the Allura estate was proposed for the cleared land south of the woodland. If this is correct, why has it changed? Current plans now show that a lifestyle village will now be located in the woodland after the removal of 51 trees. Trees of this age and bearing cannot be replaced. Once they're gone, they're gone. Removing 51 trees will reduce the habitat so much that it may be unviable as a habitat area for existing flora and fauna. An area of predominantly large grey box, their local trees and important understory so close to the town is invaluable. It's part of the corridor reaching from the golf course leading to Lake Ngambie. Potentially, the current woodland area is an important recreational area with walking tracks and picnic spots to enhance the whole of the Allura estate and ambience of Ngambie. It's unique. It's part of Ngambie. It's part of Ngambie heritage and a lifestyle we look forward to. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. We did have 9 speakers submitted, registered. I'm not sure whether the 9th one is here.
I think that was the applicant, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, right, I think, fine. Okay. So the speaker for the applicant is Michael Locasano. Thanks, Michael. Just to 3 minutes.
Mr. Chair, we have one person that wasn't registered to speak with the sector. Are you happy to hear them?
Did they register to speak?
No, they have
not. No, I think we've got Mr. Locasano in the chair now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Dear councillors, mayor and council staff, in the very limited time I have available, I don't wish to repeat all that has been previously explained or provided to you in writing in response to the matter before you today. Whilst this matter is specifically in relation to the removal of native vegetation on our land, the decision comes with a significant flow-on effect. We have spent 7 years in the planning process to get to this point, and we have followed every process to the letter of the law. We've worked with all the required authorities to achieve all the necessary permits and approvals, including the highest authority in the state of Victoria the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, who have approved our application with conditions acceptable to us. I remind the Council of the following very important facts. The land in question is private land, not community land, not public land, private land. It is zoned comprehensive development and has been for some time. The removal of vegetation has always been contemplated for this section of Allura, and previous permits approved the removal of 100 trees for subdivision. We've come a long way since then. We are retaining a significant area of vegetation, including 160 trees with open spaces on the land. We have DELP approval with conditions which further protect the flora and fauna on the site and ensure that native offset planting is achieved. We will work with the Broken Catchment Management Authority to reuse any of the removed vegetation to achieve better outcomes within the Shire. We don't believe there is any reason, legally or otherwise, that Council should not approve this application as recommended by Council's own planning department. I don't know what expert qualifications some of these objectors have or what their motives are, but I do take exception to the way they have been making false accusations on social media to rally support for their cause. If they are suggesting that we as the applicant, the Shire of Strathbogie or the Department of Environment have not followed the legal process to the letter of the law, then they would want to be very, very careful about their actions, as it will have severe legal and financial consequences. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. Our federal and state governments are spending billions of dollars to try and stimulate our economy, which is now in recession and likely to get worse. Our company is committed, as it has always been, to investing up to $100 million on this project over the next 5 to 7 years, which will have significant positive flow-on effects to the town of Ngambie. Abington Lifestyle Village will be a development that provides a high quality yet affordable housing choice for seniors in our community, designed to complement the landscape and the town of Ngambie. I respectfully ask councillors to consider very seriously your decision on this very important matter, which will impact on the livelihoods of local suppliers, tradespeople, business owners, residents and the broader economy of Strathbogie Shire during these very uncertain times. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. That concludes those who want to address the Planning Committee. I just will acknowledge, though, that other parties present upstairs, I believe, but are not registered to speak were Deb Dudley, Susan Slee, Trish Lell, Jacqueline Palmer, Jackie Anton and Pamela Crook, I think probably is there. And present for the applicant was Peter Story, or is Peter Story. Okay, we have a recommendation, and it is recommended that Council resolve to issue a notice of decision to grant a permit in accordance with the officer's recommendation. And I notice that there are 15 conditions on this notice of decision. Would someone like to move as such? Councillor Gardner. We got a seconder?
Second.
Councillor McLaren. Thank you. Councillor Gardner.
Mr. Chairman, in addressing this planning permit, I've referred to a number of the documents that set out the planning and growth for Ngambie. In particular, the Ngambie Growth Management Strategy, which was first published in 2008, which set the blueprint for how Ngambie should develop. Currently, there's a draft proposal out and being reviewed by the public, which will take the strategy through to the 2030s. And I note in that strategy that the requirement in Ngambie, because of the pressures of people wanting to come and live in this locality, is going to require another 1,200 housing units over that period. That's this proposed development every 2 years. With this planning permit, it has included as clause 2 that a comprehensive environment plan will be developed and approved before any native timber is to be removed. Like the objectors, I'm aware of the conditions that the Department of, place on developments where native vegetation is to be removed. In this case, with the reduction, as the applicant has just said, from originally 100 trees down to 51 trees to be removed, I believe that the avoidance criteria of that requirement has been met. I believe also that in the area of minimisation of damage to the environment, I believe with the alterations to the facilities in the lifestyle village, the removal of units, the reduction in the units that are being built, the use of pathways which are not invasive on the remaining native vegetation, and the fact that the native vegetation that is remaining will be protected when vegetation is removed. Now, I think that the minimisation of damage to the native vegetation has been met. And it goes without saying that the offset provisions, although they are outside of the Shire, they have also been met. DWELP asked us as councillors to further approach the applicant to see if there was room for further removal of native vegetation on the site. And I noticed a response that we received on the 15th of June said that if any further vegetation was to be retained, the project would be in serious risk. And I believe that through this process, the participants in this planning process have acted in good faith. And I believe that a balanced outcome has been achieved for Ngambie, the vegetation, and for the applicant. I am concerned, Mr. Chairman, as one of the objectors said, that if this planning process, if the decision making is taken out of our hands, I am concerned that the outcome may be at variance to what the planners and the participants have achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Goldner. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Under our local law number 1 meeting procedures, item 64A6B, I respectfully reserve my right to speak at the conclusion of debate, please.
That's okay. Councillors, anyone else would like to speak to or for this recommendation? Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we've heard, the Avington Lifestyle Village is an important development for Ngambie. It's going to accommodate, again, as we've heard, roughly a 20% increase in the permanent resident population. And it's going to increase the diversity of housing stock and cater for a growing demographic that the town needs to cater for. So it's an important development. The native vegetation on the site is also important. If you take a Google Earth view of our Shire from Avenel to Arcadia and from the Golden River to the Hume Freeway, primarily the vegetation you see is on watercourses and roadways. One of the very few patches of substantial vegetation is still on the Allura site. And not only is it a substantial piece of woodland, it's also in an endangered ecological vegetation class. So we've got an important development and we've also got important residual native vegetation there. I don't think it's my role here to judge whether 73 trees should go or 51 trees should go or every tree should go or none of the trees should go. I think my role is to see that the application for the native vegetation removal has been correctly considered in the context of the Strathbogie planning scheme. And to look at the advice and evidence that's put forward by people who know more about native vegetation than I do. So the applicant clearly and their consultants, the Shire staff, the objectors and the referral authority, DELP. And from that, we should be able to see what presents itself as the way forward. I note primarily the decision by DELP not to oppose the issuing of a permit, subject conditions. But I also note, as required under Section 56 of the Planning and Environment Act, the comments that they provide. So in my profession of accounting, we'd kind of call this a qualified approval. It is an approval, but there are some quite significant notes that accompany it that should be considered by the council. And it's because of those notes that I feel I don't have enough advice, frankly, and enough evidence to approve the application in its current form. And therefore, I'm going to oppose the recommendation. And my reasons for that are really twofold. As has been noted, the site is in the Comprehensive Development Zone that was created in the Strathbogie Planning Scheme in 2008. So the CDZ, which is section 37.02 of the scheme, and Schedule 1 that accompanies it, goes into some detail about how the development should proceed. And how essentially, or primarily, the development should be in accordance with the Lake Ngambie Resort Master Plan. Now, the development that we're talking about today bears very little resemblance to the original master plan that drove the planning scheme amendment in 2008. But as is noted by the officers in the report, the master plan was amended in 2014 to something closer, but not the same, as a design subject to the native vegetation removal application today. But that amendment wasn't treated as a planning scheme amendment, meaning there was no referral at the time to the main referral authority, DELP. It was handled.
Mr. Chairman, we are considering a planning permit in front of us today. I accept that the history of the development of the Allura estate is interesting, but it's not relevant to the planning permit which we are approving today.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Gardner.
Respond to that, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Thompson, yes.
So I'm actually not actually talking about the history. I'm actually talking about section 37.02, which is fundamental in the report to what we're considering here. So I'm talking about the context of that. And if you bear with me for 30 seconds more, it is to say, well, we may want to roll on that if you wish. Because the amended plan was not treated as a planning scheme amendment and no referral to referral authorities, I then note the comment that DELP has now made that if a referral would have occurred, it would have enabled them to provide comments into the planning scheme, which are not there. So the purpose of the Planning Environment Act is to establish a framework for planning the use, development and protection of land for present and long-term interest. So much has changed with this development since 2008 in terms of use and development. And there have been significant changes in legislation with regards to native vegetation and water since 2008. So I feel I'm being asked to consider this application against the backdrop of a planning scheme amendment that's obsolete. With such substantial change, I think there should be a formal amendment to section 37.02, which is very relevant to this. It's primarily what the application is judged against, apart from 52.17, with a referral to other authorities for guidance. My second reason for opposing the application is with regard to the guidelines for the removal, destruction and lopping of native vegetation. Again, I don't feel comfortable that I've got enough information to arrive at a decision. So being forced to make a decision, I'm going to oppose the recommendation. The three-step process in the guidelines is to avoid, minimise or offset if vegetation is removed. There's no doubt, and Councillor Gardner pointed this out, there's no doubt that the applicant has taken significant steps to achieve avoidance, to minimise some impact and primarily to provide offsets. But my question is, has as much avoidance as possible been achieved? So while DELP is not objecting to the permit subject to conditions, they have recommended to Council that additional opportunities are explored with the applicant to avoid the loss of further high and very high value trees. I would have liked to have seen consideration of this matter deferred to consider more options, but that's not going to happen. The large number of unresolved objections, I think you said there were 45, indicates to me that the process should not have ended at this point today. I don't think that as a whole, we can say as council that we've done the best we could to see if an amended outcome was possible. So I'm going to oppose the decision how to give a notice of, I'm going to oppose the recommendation to give a notice of decision to issue a permit.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Any other comments from other councillors?
Through you, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I sit here and have looked at this development, and I've spoken to Michael on the phone about it, and I've seen his development down in Point Cook, and I think it's a wonderful development down there. My biggest issue is I sit here at the moment and look out this window and I see all those trees over there. And I know there's 200 trees in the development site. There's 51 going to be removed. But to me, I have an issue of any tree being removed. That's just my ecological idea, that we live in a society now that where we should be looking after our natural environment as much as possible. Our forefathers left those trees there for a reason. We now should protect that, because back when, after the First World War, when the army settlements where people were given 10 acres or whatever it was, and they had to clear an acre every year to keep the land, why weren't those trees removed? And that's the part that eats away at me all the time, is that why should I allow something to go ahead which will destroy history, the respect and understanding of those trees? A lot of them are over 200 years old, and I can't foresee me destroying that environment. So won't be agreeing with the motion.
Councillor Rayburn, any other comments? Councillor McLaren, you have your right to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I've heard from the other councillors in relation to the item before us, and before Councillor Gardner sums up, I'd like to express my thoughts in relation to the planning application before us. Firstly, I would like to thank all those who have made submissions to council on this permit application, both in support and in opposition to this permit application. I admire and respect all those who have personally contacted me to discuss this application or have presented to council their thoughts on this application. These conversations and submissions help councillors to ask further questions and seek the information required to make an informed decision. Personally, this is a very difficult decision for me to make, as I hate the thought of any native vegetation being removed, especially large trees. I've worked in natural resource management, land care, and I live on a property that's surrounded by Box Owenbach National Park. I appreciate the benefit trees bring to our landscape, both natural and built. However, that said, I have to make my decision on the information that has been provided in this permit application and under the Planning and Environment Act 1987. The purpose of this act is to establish a framework for planning, the use and development and protection of land in Victoria. In the lead up to this meeting, not all the information that has been presented to the community gives the full picture. So I would like to refer to the application that we have before us. This report on pages 33 to 69 of the agenda contains the background information prepared by the Council Planning Department. I refer you to page 45, which explains the history of the site for the application before us, and on page 39, the history of the amendments on this application. Specifically, on this site, a comprehensive development zone was gazetted by state government on the 6th of November 2008. The process to create this comprehensive development zone and all the supporting documentation, including the stages from exhibition starting on the 6th of September 2007 to gazettal on the 6th of the 11th 2008 is publicly available on the internet. Mr Chair, Council is required to make planning decisions under the Planning Environment Act 1987. Council and councillors around the table are not experts in all areas that come before us, and as such, the planning process and applications are referred to statutory bodies such as the water authorities, DELP, CFA, etc., who are experts in these areas. These statutory authorities have the knowledge and expertise to provide recommendations to Council for planning decisions. Planning applications are also required to consider the protection of cultural heritage of traditional owners, in this case, the Tongarong. DELP is the expert referral authority for the native vegetation, and Council rely on their expertise and advice, and they granted permission for this application. During this process, DELP have outlined on page 58 of the agenda, worked with the applicant to amend their designs to reduce and avoid native vegetation removal, and then signed off their permission, even if it has got notes to it. DELP could have refused this application, and then the recommendation before Council would have been to refuse to grant permission to remove native vegetation. As a councillor, I have to consider this in my decision making. DELP are the experts in the area of native vegetation, and I have to rely on their expertise and recommendation in my decision making. The traditional owners of this area are the Tongarong. The Tongarong have assessed this application and provided their approval of the Cultural Heritage Management Plan on page 33 of the agenda and page 55 of the agenda. The applicant has committed to working with the Tongarong with the trees to be removed to provide educational opportunities for the youth prior to tree removal on pages 66 of the agenda. The Golden Broken Catchment Management Authority will also be utilising these trees in their river health program to help with fish habitat in the Golden Broken catchment. It's also worth noting that as part of this application, the applicant is required to undertake an environmental plan and offsets that will be planted in the Golden Broken catchment. Again, the offsets are determined by independent experts and purchased through an approved broker within the catchment. Objections raised to concerns on this permit application were outlined by our officer and are listed on page 41 of the agenda. However, the report before us states this development will provide 400 new residents to our township of Nagambie. It will provide valuable jobs post-COVID-19 to local tradespeople, and these residents will further contribute to the local economy. Council has received letters of support for this application to proceed from Nagambie Healthcare and the local tourism and commerce group Go Nagambie, who we heard from tonight. So whilst personally I will be deeply saddened to see any trees removed, with those in hearing from our community, for those even seeing any of the trees removed from the landscape, I will be supporting this application based on the facts before me and the additional information that has been sought and provided to Council. I thank the applicant for the measures undertaken to date to avoid and minimise to reduce the number of trees to be removed from the original 73 to 51. However, I also respectfully request and encourage the applicant to continue to seek any further possible measures to reduce the number of large trees to be removed and to look at connecting the remaining patches of vegetation that remain on the Allura site to the stands of vegetation to the south of Vickers Road to provide biodiversity connectivity between these patches of vegetation. Finally, Mr Chair, this application has generated a lot of passion on both sides within our community. I strongly encourage our residents to have their say on the future of Nagambie by contributing to the Nagambie Growth Management Plan, which is currently out for consultation. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you, Councillor McLaren. To sum up and close the debate, Councillor Gardner.
Mr Chairman, thank you. Obviously, as we've heard, native vegetation is a very emotive issue. I take on board Councillor Thompson's comments that we are not experts at being able to judge native vegetation and how it should be handled. That is why DWELP was used as the consulting body to give us their recommendations. I would love to know more to be able to be an authority on it, but I haven't got the years left to be able to do that. I think, as I summed up earlier, that on balance, this planning permit has been handled in good faith by all those involved. And I think it is an outcome that can be lived with by all parties. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Gardner. Okay, we have a recommendation that council resolve to issue a notice of decision to grant a permit in accordance with the officer's recommendation. And the recommendation's got 15 conditions in it. You've got it all on the agenda. I won't read them out unless you want me to. But I think that it's pretty evident that what's included in those recommendations. So that is it. All those in favour? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those against? 2. That's
Call a division.
sure. Okay, division's been called by Councillor Thompson. All those in favour? Councillor Mason, Councillor Gardner, Councillor Little, Councillor McLaren, Councillor Williams. All those against? Councillor Rayburn and Councillor Thompson. On the result of that, that has been carried 5-2. Thank you. We now move on to Planning Committee Report number 3. And again, this is the hands of Melissa. Planning Permit Application number P2020-013. Use and development of land for a dwelling and shed at 378 Goulburn Weir, Murchison Road, Goulburn Weir. Melissa.
This application is for a dwelling and a shed at 378 Goulburn Weir, Murchison Road, as stated. The site is 1.754 hectares of land and it adjoins the Goulburn River. The application is being heard by council as it is a dwelling on a small lot in the farming zone and it's not within the Strathbogie Shire Rural Residential Strategy. The site is actually in an area that is generally used for rural living purposes along that side of Goulburn Weir, Murchison Road, although that's not reflected in the strategy from 2004. The location of the dwelling will actually create a minimum of approximately 200 metres setback from the nearest agricultural land uses, and any potential conflicts are offset both by this distance and the existing native vegetation that's been planted on the site. It's proposed to manage this planted area for biodiversity outcomes in order to address the requirements of the zone itself and the local planning policy at 2103. The land is limited in its ability to be used for agriculture, and it is considerable that it is a reasonable outcome for a site of this size in the zone to have an environmental outcome rather than a farming one to support the use of the land for a dwelling. And it's respectfully recommended that a notice of decision to just a planning permit be granted for this one. There is no objections to it. Thanks, you, Melissa. Mr. Chair.
Okay, I've noticed there haven't been any objections, so therefore there's no one registered to speak for it. So I'll put the recommendation, and it is recommended that council resolve to grant a permit in accordance with the officer's recommendation, of which there are 30 conditions and 5 planning notes. Someone like to move that as such? Thank you, Councillor McLaren. Seconded by, thank you, Councillor Mason. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think our planning officer has been very clear in outlining this application, and I will be supporting this application. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mason.
Yes, I think this is actually quite a straightforward one, and I notice all the conditions. There's no objections, and yes, I'll be supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Any other comments from any councillors for or against? If not, it's recommended that council resolve to grant a permit in accordance with the officer's recommendation. All those in favour? All those against? That's carried 7-0. Thank you. Finally, page 94 in your agenda. Planning Committee report number 4. Planning applications received between the 5th of May to the 2nd of June 2020. The recommendation is that the report be noted. Moved by Councillor Williams. Seconded by, sorry, Councillor Rayburn. That'll do. So all those in favour? That is carried 7-0. Thank you. Now that concludes the meeting. Can I just say what a great meeting? How our planners have handled it very, very well. Thank you, planners, for all your input. And I know you're the only one that's actually here, but I know they're all about up there somewhere. So thank you very much, Melissa. And I'll close the meeting at 5:08. Thank you.